This reading is from The Jazz Life by Nat Hentoff, and it's part of the chapter on studio time. Louis Armstrong was 45 minutes late for the first session of an album he was to make with the Dukes of Dixieland for Audio Fidelity. Sid Frey, the label's voluble, intense owner, was not disturbed by Louis's tardiness. "It takes him half a day to get up," Frey explained to a bystander while waving at Armstrong. "Then it takes him a couple of hours for the lip salves and the checking of the horn. He lives his life for that horn." When he arrived, Louis, who had gained some weight in recent months, was in buoyant spirits. He greeted the Dukes, a white Dixieland combo, warmly, and they treated him with marked deference. Louis was in sports shirts and slacks, as were the other players, and Mr. Frey. The latter prowled the studio, checking microphones. Frey moved in on Louis, who was gently unpacking his horn. "Louis, have you decided whether you'll do that Bert Williams tune, Nobody?" Louis looked up, grinned and shook his head negatively. "Mr. Glaser thinks the NAACP wouldn't like that." Mr. Glaser is the shrewd, apoplectic Joe Glaser, Louis's personal manager and head of the Associated Booking Corporation, the most powerful agency in the jazz field. Glaser has the final veto over Armstrong's personnel, repertory, and nearly everything else concerning the band. Frey shook his head disgruntledly and walked away. "I don't believe it," he muttered. "I think Glaser is saving that song for an all Bert Williams album, for another label." The huge Webster Hall studio, meanwhile, was clanging alive in the jangle of trombone blasts, shouts from Frey in the control room to turn that mic a little, a spiralling trumpet, and general disjointed noises. Webster Hall on the New York's Lower East Side occasionally doubles as a site for local neighbourhood functions, but is most often in use for RCA Victor's pop recordings. When time is available, a number of independent entrepreneurs, such as Frey, use the hall and generally also employ RCA staff engineers. By 3 o'clock, an hour and a half after the session had been scheduled to start, Frey was moderately satisfied with the way he had set up his forces. The Dukes and Louis was arranged in a large triangle. To the right of the control room, young trumpeter Frank Assunto and tuba player Rich Mattison were stationed. To the left of the booth were Frank's brother Fred on trombone and clarinetist Jerry Fuller, who had joined the Dukes after 5 years with Jack Teagarden. In the centre of the triangle's base was Louis Armstrong. At the apex of the triangle sat the drummer, Mo Mahoney. Between Mahoney and the trumpet tuba corner was pianist Stan Mendelsohn. Between Mahoney and the trombone clarinet position was Jack Assunto, father of Frank and Fred. Jack doubles on banjo and trombone. Armstrong's wife, Lucille, a woman of great charm and total devotion to her husband, brought Louis a cup of coffee. In the control room, RCA staff engineer Ray Hall, a young man for whom New York jazz musicians have a particular respect, was saying softly to Frey, "We could spend some time with the clarinet. It's the only instrument that's peaking." Frey agreed. The stocky, bustling Frey is a man who stampeded the record business into stereo by first releasing a stereo disc in the industry in November 1957. and then making studio recordings available to the public the following February. A compulsive lecturer, Frey was vehemently indoctrinating a visitor as Armstrong continued warming up. "We record with very little reverberation," Frey declared. "There's already enough in the room, maybe a little bit too much. And we get all the presence, intimacy and warmth of sound we can, so that the listener can identify with what's going on. Lewis, for example, leaves me emotionally exhausted, but until we cut him, he hadn't been recorded right so that the record buyers could get his full impact." Audio Fidelity had already released Satchmo Plays King Oliver and had recorded, but not released, a June 1959 meeting between Armstrong and the Dukes of Dixieland. The latter was being held up because Lewis had used some tunes in it that he had recorded for Decca a few years ago and was not supposed to record again for 5 years. For both last year's session and the new album with the Dukes, Frey had paid Armstrong $40,000. Lewis, meanwhile, was producing vibrantly full round tones in his warm-up. Now 60, Armstrong continues to play with the most richly plangent tone in jazz, and at his best, his solos are still models of economy and passionate order. "Pops," Frey spoke into the control room microphone in his customary roar, "could you stand more in front of the mic?" Lewis did, and decided to warm up the band as well as himself in Indiana, a tune he usually plays at the beginning of a nightclub or concert date. Added to the high command in the control room was Joe Delaney, manager of the Dukes of Dixieland. A Louisiana lawyer with extensive experience in the record business, Delaney is tall, relaxed and alert. Although his crew-cut hair is greying, Delaney has a perennial innocence of mane. As Indiana ended, the restless Frey said to no one in particular, "This is a typical Audio Fidelity session. They're doing a number we're not going to record." "Pops," shouted Frey, "will you want to face in any particular direction?" Lewis turned to the control room. "No, you place it where you want to, darling," and broke into laughter. "Pops, I want you to be comfortable," Frey persisted. "No," Lewis said seriously, "you fix it. I don't know anything about microphones. You put it where you want, and I'll play there." Lewis and the Dukes began to discuss the routing of Avalon, the first number to actually be recorded for the album. Lewis looked at the control room and grinned. "Anyone in there know the lyrics to Avalon?" No one did. Lewis began to sing what he remembered. "I found my love in Avalon, beside the bay." He stopped. "Well, there's no sense in telling them all we did there," and chuckled. "Want to let them run it down once?" asked Ray Hall, "before we make it?" "No," said Delaney. "Let's try our luck." "We're rolling," Fred's voice shot out into the hall. "Take one." The tape broke down when Lewis slipped. I found my girl." "Lewis," said Frey, "sing into the same mic you play into, and take it easy on the drums behind the vocal." "All right," Frey turned to Hall. "Rewind the tape." "We can't erase today," said Hall. "That's nice," said Frey. Frey grimaced. "I like to have the tape concession here." The next try worked out well. Lewis improvised on the lyrics. "I found my girl in Avalon, beside the bay. Oh, she was nice in Avalon, I'll say. But now we up in Harlem, and oh boy, hey, hey. She's not down in Avalon, folks. She's right here in the studio today." Frey decided to ask for another tape and went out into the hall to adjust Armstrong's microphone. You see what I mean by the fray curtain of sound? Fray rhetorically asked the visitor in the control room as he came back in. It's not at all ping-pong. I like a broad panorama of sound, so that each one of the elements is placed and heard according to where he's actually be standing in a performance. The next Avalon was superb, with a thrilling high note ending by Lewis. The musicians relaxed and listened to the playback. Lewis sure is making the Dukes sound good, said the visitor, almost like jazzmen. There's more to them than you think, said the manager, Delaney, defensively. Well, said the visitor, you know what jazzmen and critics think of them. Circus playing, mechanical routines, a thumping rhythm section, and very predictable solos. I don't think you've heard them enough, Delaney countered. For one thing, the boys spend a lot of time digging modern jazz, and they've never gone in for the hokum like funny hats. They walked off that Firestone TV show on ABC because they wouldn't wear straw hats, and they absolutely refused to put on corny uniforms on any other show. Delaney had become the manager of the Dukes a few years ago when he was at Tulane getting a law degree. Previously, he had been an executive director at Decca, Coral and London. The Dukes had started some 11 years ago as a neighbourhood band in New Orleans, formed by Frank and Fred Asunto. First called the Basement Street Four, or 5 or 6 depending on their manpower, they later toured with Horace Heidt Troupe as the Junior Dixieland Band, and finally named themselves the Dukes of Dixieland. The band first realised its drawing power during a 44-month run at the famous store in New Orleans. When Delaney became head of the now defunct Victor subsidiary Label X, he recorded the Dukes for that label. During one of their Las Vegas engagements, however, Sid Frey heard them, thought they could become big record sellers, and finally convinced Delaney of this point. Since October 1956, the Dukes had made 11 albums for Frey, with a total sale of over 1,300,000. Louis Armstrong walked into the control room. You really like playing with them? Asked the newcomer, who was an old friend of Louis. Sure, said Louis. They're homeboys. Whenever we're playing in the same town, I go and sit in. We have a ball. Well, Louis likes Lombardo too, said another hanger-on. What you forget, Delaney bristled, is that the Dukes draw a wide range of ages. They appeal to more than the usual jazz audience. Their fans include many adults and many people well above the age of income. And many people well above the average in income. Before the Blue Note in Chicago folded, for example, we would draw less people than Count Basie, but they would spend more. This is good time music, Frey moved into the discussion. It's not complicated and it's happy. If your appliance dealer is hip, and many of them are, he'll drop a record by the Dukes on a turntable when he's selling equipment. The adults who buy tables and amplifiers generally like that kind of music and will take a record home for the kids too. The break was over. Frey asked for Avalon once more. Armstrong, sitting down and warming up, asked Frankie Asunto, "What key, baby? Is that again?" "F," said Asunto. "What's here Thursday?" Frey asked Ray Hall. "We may need more sessions than I've counted on." "A beefsteak party at 4 o'clock, said Hall, deadpan. "Humph," Frey commented. By the time he reached the vocal in the new version, Louis had changed the words again. "Yes, I found my love in Avalon, beside the sea. Oh, she was awful nice in Avalon. She was cute as can be. But now we're in Harlem, Lord. And boy, you know, she knocks me out in Avalon, and she's here with me today." Louis followed the vocal with a climbing explosive solo. Frankie Assunto, sitting on a stool with trumpet in his lap, gazed trance-like at Lewis with a smile and smiled seraphitically. Lewis tore the trumpet from his lips at the end of the solo, laughed in satisfaction, and walked away from the mic. The tune ended, but Frey held up his arm dramatically for silence. At the end of 10 seconds he put it down. "We must get those 10 seconds of cymbal ring," he explained. "It's a natural sound." During the playback, Lewis was talking with grey-haired Papa Jack Assunto. Assunto had brought up the subject of famous New Orleans restaurants. Lewis was guarded. He is bitter about discrimination in his hometown and no longer enjoys playing there. "They still have Antoine's and all them places," Lewis finally warmed a little to the discussion. "Yes," Assunto assured him. The musicians had been confident that the previous take was the final one, but Frey strode out into the hall. "I heard an engineer," he announced, "who said he could do better on another shot." "Were you the engineer?" a suspicious onlooker whispered to Frey. No," said Frey. "Ray really wants to do another. He says he knows what he wants to do now." The Dukes had clustered round Lewis. "That's a very religious family," Frey pointed to the Assunto brothers, "but with them, Lewis ranks second to nobody, not even Jesus Christ." After another take of Avalon, Frey resumed lecturing. "The point is that if you can get the cleanest possible sound with the least possible distortion, you can put more volume on the tape and you get a better signal-to-noise ratio." Rahal raised his eyebrows but said nothing. Dixie was proposed as the next tune. Lewis began to read the lyrics but stopped, chuckling. "No, I can't sing that. The coloured cats would put me down." "You know," said Rahal, a Negro, "I always thought he was an Uncle Tom, but he's not. And such a cooperative guy." Several friends of Lewis had come into the hall, greying Gene Krupa and trumpeter Max Kaminsky among them. Armstrong and Krupa embraced, and then Lewis caught sight of a Long Island neighbour, Dizzy Gillespie. Dizzy, though a key representative of the modern jazz that Lewis once contemptuously called Chinese music, is an admirer of Armstrong, and the two have become friends. "I was in his house just yesterday," Dizzy was saying to a jazz writer. Dizzy listened for a few minutes to the playback of Avalon. "He sure can play, can't he?" Dixie was shelved, and the Wolverine Blues took its place. Wordlessly, Lewis sung the way he wanted the ending to go. "You see what I mean?" he said to Frankie Assunto. "You got to watch it close." "I think we're ready for a take," Frey boomed from the control room, but photographers from the Daily News, oblivious of Frey, were shooting Lewis, Krupa and Gillespie for promotion pictures in connection with a jazz concert the paper was sponsoring. "I'll be glad when these photographers get out of here," Frey said to Delaney. Max Kaminsky, whose jazz renown had faded in recent years, stood against the wall watching the picture-taking. "Hey!" a sensitive friend of Lewis shouted to the photographers. "There's Maxie! Get him in there too." Kaminsky was duly included in the next set of pictures. "Gentlemen," said Frey icily, "may we proceed, please?" The picture-taking stopped. "I want all spectators," Frey's voice cannonaded round the control room, "to be as quiet as possible. The mics are wide open." "It's getting to look like a Sinatra recording session." Joe Delaney pointed to the crowd outside the booth. "Yes," said Frey, "and I don't like it." After the first take, Frey expressed dissatisfaction with the opening. "The beginning is always the most important part of a record. Let's do it again." By 4:15, the take of Wolverine Blues had been tentatively approved. Armstrong had played excellently, but he wasn't satisfied. He and the Dukes began discussing changes. "This is the way we play it," Frankie was saying. "Yes," answered Lewis. "I'll listen and find a little part for myself." The Dukes, standing round the seated Lewis, started to play. Lewis fingered his horn and finally joined in. "Now," Lewis said to Frankie, "when you finish that chorus, I'll take over and play the obligation to your solo." The Dukes laughed at Lewis's play on the word. "I," Frey announced to Delaney in the control room, "would rather have excitement and mistakes than no excitement and no mistakes. That's why I try to get complete takes whenever I can. I try not to have them do too many. By the 5th or 6th time round, the arrangement may be more polished, but the playing begins to lose excitement." "Can the drummer tighten the snares?" Ray Hall asked Frey, "so they don't echo so much?" Frey instructed the drummer. After the next take, Frey asked if the musicians wanted to try another one right away. "Pops," Frey added, "you've got to stay on mic more." "I'm trying," says Lewis. Sid Delaney spoke softly. "Have Ray lower the volume when you're talking from the control room. You come on like Ethel Merman." "Yes," said Hall, "and step back a little." "OK," said Frey, looking somewhat surprised and chastened. "I'll talk softly." "Now," Frey announced with self-conscious gentleness, "at the end of the next take, everyone please be quiet. We're trying to catch the cymbal into the very last ring." During the take, Lewis stood, arms wide apart, stomach out, enjoying the music. He then unleashed a brilliant stop-time solo, a solo in which the rhythm section does not play continuously. The take was approved, and Lewis and the Dukes began to work out an instrumental version of Dixie. Lewis started to walk round the hall, playing without accompaniment until he found the right tempo he wanted. The Dukes soon fell into the same groove. During the break in the recording, Sid Frey and Lewis began swapping jokes. Frankie Assunto was shaking his head. "The old man is too much," he said. "I always thought I'd be afraid to play with him, but he's the easiest person in the world to work with. The first time we recorded in Chicago, however, was an experience. I had such an emotional letdown after the first recording session last year that while I was driving down to the loop, it took me several minutes to realise I was only going 15 miles an hour. It was like I was in a trance. I was so depressed and tired. But later that night, Lewis walked into the nightclub where we were playing. As soon as he said, 'Hello,' I was all right again." I don't think he says it quite that way, anyway. The playback was ending. "It sounds like an old marching band," Frankie called over to Lewis. Lewis broke into an exaggerated strut. "Yes, indeed," he laughed. "And they've all got their caps on."